loggia was used in the 1950s on Saturday afternoons to broadcast the Metropolitan Opera radio program and to host art fairs. Now, thanks to your generosity, the foundation offers free adult literary programs throughout the season. For today, on behalf of our board, I'd especially like to thank the Peace River team at Morgan Stanley, who generously called and offered to sponsor today's speaker. Thank you, Ryan Rupert, Eric Loesch, and Monica Luna. Thank you very much. We welcome today my fellow board member, Linda Fairstein, in conversation with her friend, Meryl Gordon, to talk about Meryl's book, The Woman Who Knew Everyone, The Power of Pearl Mesta, Washington's most famous hostess. I can only imagine that if Pearl Mesta was here today and found out we were celebrating our 75 years, she would say, what a great excuse for a spectacular party. Meryl, as we all arrived today, all bundled up, we look forward to hearing from you about the hostess with the mostest, and we are thrilled you are here to help us celebrate 75 years.
Can I thank all of you? I am so honored on this kind of a windy day that all of you came out. I was braced to have 3 people in the audience. So Linda and I really want you to have a good time. We'll do our best to make that happen. Thank you.
And thank you. It's Meryl's first trip to our island paradise, and I promised her a wonderful Florida weekend in the middle of January. But really, I mean, the turnout is just spectacular. And
thank the library too. You
Yes.
know, Bobby and Julian and everybody who's been Cappy and everybody who's been great. Thank you.
This book, as you may have seen if you've looked at the book jacket, debuted just a year ago to an avalanche of praise. Writers would kill to have the kind of reviews that Meryl had for this book. The Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Daily Beast, Airmail. She was on CBS Sunday Morning. She was Amazon's #1 in biographies to read. Town and Country said this is a must-read book of 2025. And John Meacham, who makes an appearance here occasionally, said the hugely well-respected writer, he's the hugely well-respected writer. Reading my own notes, said of this hugely well-respected writer, it's an absorbing and illuminating portrait of a lost world. Now, before Meryl starts, and I start with her, I'm going to say just a word to the ladies in this audience. This is Meryl's 4th biography of really intelligent, interesting women. 4th one, Pearl Mesta, lived to be 92. That's young for one of Meryl's biographies. Bunny Mellon lived to the age of 103. Huguette Clark to 104. And Brooke Astor to 105. So if you are looking for someone to tell your life story, and you live on Boca Grande, we know you're going to live for a long time. We know you're philanthropic because you're here supporting the library, and I know you'll do more going forward, though I was not asked to say that. But most importantly, Meryl is looking for eccentric. All of these women have one common thread. They're pleasantly eccentric or quirky. So if you feel you fit all these characteristics, you just slip me a note at the end of the day, and I will be sure that Meryl gets it. You started your professional life, Meryl, as a journalist for some of the best magazines and newspapers in this country. Tell us a bit about that, because you did not set out to be a great biographer.
Well, thank you so much. I got my start at the Cincinnati Post, writing about crime and obituaries, and also in Rochester, New York. I worked in Washington for Annette, covering economics and Federal Reserve and Treasury, so not exactly this. And then I went to New York, where I worked for New York Magazine and Vanity Fair, and I began writing profiles. And biographies are basically very long versions of profiles. And I was very lucky with my first book, which was on the scandal over Brooke Astor. I'm sure many of you remember that. Her grandson, along with Annette and Renta and David Rockefeller, sued Brooke's son and daughter-in-law. It became a huge story, and I had been assigned a little piece for New York Magazine, and suddenly I'm right in the middle of this scandal. I'm touring every Park Avenue apartment. I'm talking to Nancy Reagan on the phone, thanks to Tom Brokaw, who helped make that possible, did that introduction. So it's been a kind of whirlwind tour for a nice Jewish girl from middle-class Rochester, New York, to suddenly be writing about all these very important, famous, and rich women.
You were a tenured professor of journalism at New York University, and you were teaching at the time you were asked to write the Brooke Astor piece, short piece for New York Magazine. You became a regular in the criminal courthouse in New York City. How much time did that trial take, and how did it translate to become a book?
I did the paperback came out, the hardcover came out before the trial when Brooke Astor's son and his lawyer were on trial. The trial lasted 5 months. And thank God I got Vanity Fair to assign me to cover it, so I had a reason to be in the courthouse. But the verdict came in the fall when I was back teaching. And I had trained every reporter in the courthouse, call me, and literally in the middle of the class I go, I have to go, So I raced downtown, I got there in time for the verdict. But it was kind of an extraordinary experience living through that whole Astor trial and the conviction. And one of the stranger moments is I had gotten to know the lawyer who was on trial for forgery and various other things. And I had interviewed him. The first day of the trial, at 9 o'clock at night, he called me. And he said, how do you think it's going? I'm thinking, you're on trial. I'm a reporter. Why are you calling me? So I think what's been really fun for my career is, and Linda will tell you later, I've got a new book I'm starting on, but it's just that I've had the privilege of interviewing so many interesting people. I saw Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller for that book, with Bunny Mellon, talked to Givenchy. So it's kind of, I think once somebody trusts you, then a lot of other people come to trust you. If you're okay for Nancy Reagan and Tom Brokaw, maybe you're okay.
Well, also, people in New York thought you were prescient because the observations in your book about Brooke Astor came to light during the trial, and your book was out first. What was that like?
One of the stranger days in the courtroom, it was really boring, so a lot of the other reporters had left. And I was sitting there, and Brooke Astor's former lawyer was talking about some old wills, trusts, and estates, and things that he was, that Brooke's son was trying to make sure he got money from his mother. And I called up his grandson to say, you should go have your mother check her divorce agreement, because I think your father has to give you money. And I think that's one of the reasons that all of these shenanigans took place. And sure enough, his mother went to the basement, dragged out her old divorce agreement, discovered that money was left to the kids, and the New York Times wrote a special story about me finding the dirt.
That's pretty good. So that book became a big bestseller, and then you went on to write about Huguette Clark. For those of you, and we have a lot of Montanans here, for those of you from Montana, she was one of the children, the daughter of the Copper King and U.S. Senator
William Andrews Clark, yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that and how eccentric she turned out to be.
That was a strange book to work on, because I felt like I was trapped in a hospital room for several years with a woman who had mental illness. Huguette was, the youngest child of the Copper King, and at some point during her life, she became a recluse, and she wouldn't let anybody see her. Literally. She had a 32-room apartment on Fifth Avenue. She had a huge house out in Santa Barbara, and literally the maid would call through the door. And eventually she ended up in the hospital, and people talked to her in the hospital, and they were nice to her, so she decided she would stay there, even though she was healthy. And then the nurses, she befriended one of the nurses, and I'm sure you all do this. She would write the nurse a $20,000 check in the morning, but in the afternoon she'd write another $30,000 one. It was amazing. The nurse got $5 million, and then all the doctors in the hospital thought, this is a good deal. Somebody came over and said, I'm fixing up my estate, and it's really costing a lot of money. You should visit. And he knew she never left the hospital, but she wrote a $20,000 check so he could repaint. So it became a huge New York scandal, and the hospital suing and relatives suing. But what was fun after that, being trapped in a hospital room for 18 months, was Bunny Mellon. As many of you know, Bunny Mellon, Jackie Kennedy's best friend, known for her taste and her style and her gardens, designed the White House Rose Garden, which sadly no longer exists. But I went from this black and white world into color with Bunny because she had amazing taste and style. I was able to spend weeks down at her farm, Oak Spring in Virginia, beautiful place. And she was also someone who saved everything. I mean, letters to her grandfather at 8 years old, every note Givenchy had ever sent her. So it was, and her family, sometimes you end up really, how do I say this, groveling to get people to talk to you. I had done a piece for Newsweek on her, and she liked the story. So I got invited to her funeral, and her grandson said, somebody's going to write the book. She liked you. It's yours. So I really got family cooperation. It was also interesting because Bunny was rich her entire life. She was born into money, and then she married Paul Mellon. Let me say, Paul Mellon left her $110 million, plus several major estates, amazing artwork. I want a show of hands. How many of you do think you could live on $110 million? She went through it in 5 years. When you're writing these books, you're thinking subway, cab, subway, cab. But anyhow, Bunny was a difficult woman, and I was very grateful that her family said up front, we loved her. She wasn't always nice to us. Write what you find. So in that situation, you're really trying to understand if somebody was difficult, why? What happened in their childhood? What shaped them to become, the person they are today? And, I think if you grow up with that kind of money, you always worry, do people like me for myself or for my money? And I think that makes you so sensitive that sometimes even the slightest hint of anything, I found all these letters in her files. Remember Kenneth the hairdresser, the famous, like, Bunny, I love you, and I know at some point you're going to cut me off, and please don't do it. I mean, there were all these letters kind of begging her not to do what she often did.
So that is a fabulous book. If you've not read it, it is just a totally different kind of life, remarkable. So now, like many writers, you get to the point where that book is over, and you're trying to figure what to do next. How did Pearl Mesta, you're too young to probably remember her, how did Pearl Mesta come to your attention?
Linda loves this story because Linda's a theater goer. So that makes her love this story. There's a City Centers in New York every year does something called Encores, where they bring back old Broadway musicals. And they were bringing back Call Me Madam, which was the Irving Berlin musical that was based on the life of Pearl Mesta. And I was going, and a friend was going, and I was kvetching about I couldn't figure out a new book idea. And she said, what about Pearl Mesta? And I thought, what about her? And I began doing research, and I found that there'd never been a full biography of her. She wrote an autobiography, and there were 100,000 clips. She was so famous in her day.
And so the phrase hostess with the mostest, I mean, I was a child of the 50s, and if my mother had a dinner party, all the ladies came in silk dresses and wore varying degrees of pearls, fake, good, real, cultured. And at the end, everybody would say, you're the hostess with the mostest. And then you'd go to the next person's house, and she was the hostess with the mostest. And I just thought it was a colloquial phrase that had been in existence a long time. And as it turns out, Irving Berlin coined that phrase for the musical Call Me Madam. So you saw the musical, and then what did you do?
I began doing deep research. One of the interesting things about that book was that Pearl died in 1975. Most of my books have been based on interviews, but because she was gone for so long, there were very few people who were still alive. She did have some great nieces who I was able to speak to. There are a number of Washington reporters like Ann Blackman of the AP and Sally Quinn who had covered her parties, but a lot of this ended up being archival research. The Truman Presidential Library, the Eisenhower Presidential Library. A few things about why that phrase, hostess with the mostest, resonated so much. Pearl was born in 1882. Her father was a farm implement salesman who was very ambitiously, went to the Oklahoma land rush, then went down to Galveston, Texas, and made his first fortune building a small town. and then went to Oklahoma where he built the largest hotel, the Skirvin. And it's still there, it's worth staying at. And as you can imagine, in 1882, the opportunities for women were pretty minuscule. And Pearl ended up using what we all call soft power, which was parties. She married George Mesta, who family came from immigrant family, built this huge steel company, Mesta, in Pittsburgh. During World War I, he was a $1 a year advisor to President Wilson, and they went to Washington. And Pearl learned the art of social climbing. And you know how it is. You sort of, there are all these underfunded, government people who have important jobs, but they don't have any money. And Pearl realized if you began to buy, tables at charity balls, if you wanted to give debutante parties for the young women, suddenly everyone wants to be your friend. So she learned, worked her way up in society that way. And she became famous. I mean, we'll come back to some of the other backgrounds, but she became famous for giving parties at political conventions. She gave huge parties for Truman, for LBJ, 5,000 person breakfast in 1960. She was going to give a party in 1968, but of course the riots in Chicago, she couldn't do that. In 1972, she didn't go because she wasn't well, and there was a whole syndicated thing saying, it can't be a convention because Pearl Mesta's not here.
But she was known, as you say in the book, as Two-Party Pearl. So give us some of the background of how her politics evolved.
Her father and her husband were both Republicans, and she was a Republican for many years. But she also was a very early supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment, and she did something which is kind of amazing when you think about it. In 1940, she managed to get the Republican Party to include the Equal Rights Amendment in their party platform at the convention. And then she went and did the same for the Democrats. She was a huge supporter of that. She was unhappy in 1940 at how the Republicans treated Willkie. So she decided to become a Democrat. Now, there was one moment where she switched back and forth. So they like calling her Two-Party Pearl because of the parties and the political parties. She really wanted LBJ to be president. And as you remember, in 1960, Kennedy had swept the primaries. LBJ still thought he might have a chance at the convention. Obviously, he didn't. And he gathered a small group of supporters to tell them he was going to take the vice presidential slot. And there's this amazing document in the LBJ library. Pearl went nuts. She's grabbing his tie, saying, "You betrayed us. How can you do this? How can you do this?" And she went out and she campaigned for Richard Nixon. Big button. How many of you think that Pearl was welcome in the Kennedy White House? The one president that she was not invited. But literally weeks after JFK was assassinated, suddenly the White House switchboard shows that LBJ was on the phone to Pearl. She was back in the White House at the first dinner party and event.
But wasn't there a Jacqueline Bouvier piece of why Pearl and the Kennedys didn't get along?
Well, I have to show you, if you'll see the book cover. Now, publishers like to sell books. So we've got, people say, why is Jackie on the cover if she and Pearl didn't get along? What do you think? Book sales. This is the only picture which JFK was cropped. He was off in the corner. It was from the 1956 presidential convention in Chicago, which Pearl gave a party and they came. Pearl knew Janet Auchincloss, Jackie's mother, for decades. They were friends in Newport, they were friends in Washington. Pearl said she met Jackie when Jackie was a young girl. Pearl gave this amazing party in London for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. Jackie was then the inquiring photographer for the Washington newspaper. And Jackie wanted to go. She went and knocked on Pearl's door in London. Can I come? Pearl said, of course. So she knew them. She was friendly with them. And she was also friendly with Jack Kennedy. She tried to fix up Jack Kennedy with Margaret Truman, which I thought was really funny. One of the things about the Truman Presidential Library was Margaret's diaries are there. And there are all this great stuff about, I have the flu, but Pearl invited me. She's going to sit me next to Jack. I'm going. I love this stuff. Pearl was always sorry it didn't take. It would have changed American history. But anyhow, when Pearl went to the Republican convention, an AP reporter interviewed her, and Pearl made some comments that were not very smart. She had just seen those famous pictures of Jack and Jackie on the Cape. Remember the windblown hair, on the boat? And Pearl gave this interview when she said she didn't agree with the First Lady on things like stockings, that Jackie didn't wear stockings, and she wore, scarves over her head. And she was very critical of Jackie, which it was social suicide. I've always wondered why she did that, because she was normally a gracious woman. She didn't say bad things about other people, but I think her anger somehow over LBJ not being the nominee got the best of her. So they had very, very late in life, there was a bit of a rapprochement, but I don't think that Jackie ever, Jackie didn't need Pearl. Pearl really wanted to be part of Jackie's world.
I think for the reader, one of the most interesting parts of the book and of Pearl Mesta's life was the period in Luxembourg, which I knew nothing about. And Call Me Madam was because she was Madam Ambassador to Luxembourg. So would you tell the story of how she got on the Truman train and how that changed her life?
Pearl had befriended Harry Truman early on when she was lobbying senators for the Equal Rights Amendment. So she met him when he was just a lowly Missouri senator. She had a knack of meeting people before they became important. She met Eisenhower in 1927. She gave an engagement party for Eisenhower's brother. She met LBJ in the 40s. So she really had a knack for this. And after Truman became vice president, Pearl gave a big party for him at the Sulgrave Club in Washington. And he had a great time. He stayed till 1 a.m. playing the piano. 6 weeks later, FDR is dead. Truman is the president. Best Truman doesn't like to entertain. Pearl Mesta is the hottest ticket in town. I mean, she's giving parties right and left. She's entertaining. It's your classic Washington thing where people are fighting all day and then they go to Pearl's in the back room, they cut a deal. She really loved the power of seating the right person next to the right person. You need a job, maybe you not have a job, let's put you together. So she loved being able to pull the strings. Again, think about women didn't have the vote till 1920, but you could use soft power to actually be quite powerful in Washington. So it's the summer of 1948, and Truman is running for re-election. I think you all remember Dewey beats Truman. No one thinks he can possibly win. He's on the famous train, the Ferdinand Magellan. They're in Texas. They're going to Oklahoma City, where Pearl is from, and they're running out of money. Literally, they can't keep the train wheels rolling. So they call Pearl, who's in Newport, who shows up, and essentially she rattles what I think of as the silver cup. She gets all these people to come on the train, raises all this money, keeps the campaign going, and it really was a huge help for him. He wanted to reward her, and it was interesting about, FDR was very good about appointing women to high office. Truman was not. So only in what essentially was equivalent to his second term did he suddenly realize maybe I should appoint some women. And there's a woman named India Edwards who was very prominent and important in the Democratic Party, and she lobbied him hard to appoint Pearl. So Pearl was nominated as what was the envoy because we didn't have an official embassy in Luxembourg. The headlines were, this woman is terrible. She never went to college. She never, she has no experience. She's a party giver. And she didn't even know if she should take the job, but she decided if he thought she could do a good job in a foreign country, she was going to go. And her time in Luxembourg was both frustrating and both fulfilling. It was frustrating because she was dealing with all of these Ivy League educated State Department men who had either been in the war or worked in the State Department who really did not want to work for her. She wrote a scorching 10-page memo to Truman, but only at the end, talking about just all the ways they tried to sabotage her in the job. But she did a couple things that were really smart. Give me 1 second. She began she didn't want to be seen as a typical diplomat. So she traveled all over the country, and she met all these mayors from small towns, and she realized many of them had never met each other. So she began giving a yearly party in Luxembourg so that all the officials could meet one another. So that went well. She went to visit an orphanage, and again, this is right after the war. There were heartbreaking scenes, and she thought if anybody needs a party, these children do. So she began to give this annual party. She imported puppet troops from Paris. That, of course, got her tremendous publicity.
presents for every child.
And presents for every child.
Every orphan.
Child.
And many orphans of American soldiers.
Yeah.
Who had
Left children there.
Left children
behind.
there. Yep.
Yeah. And the final thing she did that endeared her back home was a couple of GIs showed up one day at the embassy saying they'd bet one another a bottle of champagne that they couldn't meet Pearl. So, of course, they met Pearl. She invited them to dinner. Her sister, who had been a silent film scholar, was staying with her and helping her out. And the next day she said, Pearl, these guys are really homesick. And Pearl said, oh. So she began giving these once-a-month Saturday night parties, and she would invite any GI in Europe. By the end of it, she had entertained 25,000 soldiers. And it was all at her own expense. I mean, there was in the State Department files, there's this very pesky letter from some senator saying, who's paying for this? And it was like, Pearl. So these were the kinds of things that, in a way, her soft diplomacy and her party giving really turned out to be a very powerful and positive thing.
She wrote letters, I think, to the parents of almost every soldier she met. I mean, imagine getting a letter when your son's been away from home fighting the war. Battle of the Bulge had been in part in Luxembourg, and General Patton is buried there, which I didn't know except for reading your book. So there's just so much interesting information that you put in the book. What happened after the highlights of Pearl's life? What became of her?
Right after she left Luxembourg, she got this extraordinary invitation to visit Russia. Stalin had just died, and there were like 10 American reporters in Moscow, and that was it. They invited Pearl because they think her friendship with Ike was well known. They think that the Soviets were hoping this was going to do something. But she was allowed to tour the country in a way that no one had power plants, to see all sorts of things. She came back and she began lecturing all over the country. She wrote a newspaper series. She had really hoped that Ike, her longtime friend, would keep her as some kind of ambassador, but he wrote to her to say, I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, it's not happening. So she decided in 1955 to send herself on a goodwill tour from a country called Pearl. And she went all over the world. She met Nehru. She ended up having to flee a riot in Saigon. So once again, headlines all over the world. And she never stopped trying to fight for the ERA. I mean, she was constantly, when you write these stories, you don't really know exactly what you're going to find. And it turned out that she was a champion for civil rights. So both in her parties and everything she did for the Democratic Party, she made sure that everything was integrated. So there was back in I think it was the 1948 party she gave for Truman in Philadelphia, people were sort of shocked that there was a black man, a delegate in this party, because she had invited him. She wanted to make sure anybody was welcome. She became very close to Pearl Bailey. Pearl Bailey played Pearl Mesta in a road production of Call Me Madam. So of course, Pearl Mesta sought her out and they became friends. In 1968, as you remember, there were horrible riots after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And in Washington that summer, the Parks Department decided they wanted to do something to cheer up the community. Now, if you were going to try to organize an outdoor concert in a, inner city neighborhood, would you call a white woman in her 80s to make this possible? But they called the hostess with the mostest, who called, Pearl Bailey, who called Cab Calloway, and the next thing you know, 20,000 people are dancing outside to this free concert. So she really, there was something very indomitable about Pearl. I also thought Pearl was widowed at a relatively young age, and she really, she really worked hard to get out there. She wasn't going to sit home and wait for the phone to ring. She was going to be active. She was going to be part of the world. She was going to be calling people, inviting them to do things. She had a motto that she said her father's was, only busy people are happy. And I found it incredibly admirable that she kept going even when life wasn't always so easy for her.
I did a little research trying to find something maybe you hadn't found that connected to Boca Grande. So we are all very fortunate to have had many members of the Bush family here for many years. And I found an article from the Baltimore Sun from 1990 that although Pearl died in 1975, this 1990 article referred to First Lady Barbara Bush, often calling her husband Pearl Mesta Bush, because he had so many friends and loved having friends with them at the White House and Camp David and Texas and everywhere. So I thought that was a lovely connection to us. I want to ask you the question that when I asked you a year ago, you couldn't or wouldn't answer. The question most writers hate. So where are you with an idea for your next book?
Knows.
Well, I know that you just returned from Paris doing interviews with counts and countesses and fashion designers. So why don't you tell us about your new contract?
Back when I was working on the Bunny Mellon book, I went to interview Lee Radziwill because Jackie and Bunny were best friends. And I had this lovely interview at Lee's house, and the next day she called me and said, "We talked all about me, we didn't talk about you. Come to lunch." I'm doing a Lee Radziwill biography. As you know, she died in 2019. I was able to meet with her a number of times, and it's a fascinating life. I mean, I realize, sometimes life is painful, sometimes life is wonderful. I realize I'm starting this new year with a great adventure of meeting a lot of new, interesting people who are very important. I've already talked to Sherry Lansing, Paramount Pictures, Jan Wenner, who started Rolling Stone, Giambattista Valli, fashion designer, a French countess last week. I was running all around Paris last week in the snow interviewing Lee's friends. So I'm looking forward to another year or so of wonderful adventures writing books.
I think I would be remiss not to bring up your wonderful husband, who died a year and a half ago, Walter Shapiro, whom many of you would have known of and certainly read, one of the great political columnists of our time. And he wrote for, well, you say it.
Every place, the Washington Post, Time, Newsweek, the New Republic, and I was rereading my book this morning because you write a book and you forget, and Walter wrote all these funny, wonderful lines in it. And when I was talking about Pearl Mesta, she's inspired me because, alas, I fear many of you know, it's really rough to lose your husband, to be a widow, and you kind of need to kind of get up and go in the morning. And I was working on this book proposal for Lee when my husband became ill. And after he died, I put it aside for a year, and then I decided, life goes on, I'm going on, and so I'm happy to be able to do something new. It's going to be hard. He loved American history, and I don't know about the rest of you. Books, oh God. We have 5,000 books. They were in the kitchen closets, they're under the beds, they're everywhere. He collected historical books, and his favorite thing was, I would say things like, "What happened during the Republican Convention in 1940? He'd go, "Aha." So that I will miss a great deal, but I was very lucky. I got married in 1980, and I had almost 44 years, so you have to be grateful even if you're sad.
And I also brought Walter up for another reason. They were the quintessential New York literary couple because the collection of books was astounding. But whether you talked literature or politics or personalities, they were welcome everywhere and really added to everything. But I also brought him up because didn't Lee want to meet Walter?
Well, I think after the third or fourth time I either had lunch with Lee or she called me on the phone, my husband was like, "You're friends with Lee Radziwill? I want to meet her." So I called her and I said, "Would you like to have dinner with us?" She said, "You come to my place." So I felt like I was the third person wheel because Walter and Lee sat by the fireplace, fireplace blazing, talking politics, and even at 82, she's gorgeous. I mean, unbelievably beautiful, and was very gracious and lovely to me. I think her life was very complicated and difficult in some ways. She had a lot of tragedy. Her son died. She had 3 marriages. And having Jackie Kennedy as your older sister, that's a lot to live up to. But I think there was also a lot of joy in her life, and it's fun for me to hear from her friends about the things she took pleasure in.
Is there anything else before we open it to questions that you want to tell us about Pearl and about the book?
I came up with the book title, The Woman Who Knew Everyone, after I wrote a chapter in which she had met the Queen, Marilyn Monroe, Judy Garland, Werner von Braun. I thought, oh my God, there's no one this woman did not know who didn't make an effort. The one thing this book also taught me is sometimes as a reporter, you're a little shy. You think, maybe I should make this phone call, but I don't really want to make this phone call. And Pearl had an enemy in Washington, Gwen Kafritz. I don't know if anybody knew the Kafritzes, real estate. Well, Gwen was also a major hostess, and she and Pearl had this ongoing rivalry. So I thought I should call, Gwen's children. Oh, they probably wouldn't want to talk to me. The book came out. They want to talk to me. The sons called me several times to discuss his mother in great detail. So it made me realize, make the call, do the outreach. I think that's what I would say to all of you as we start in this new year. Obviously, things are happening every day that are hard for us to listen to. But I think it's all like trying to connect with other people, trying to build good relationships, trying to figure out why we're making the choices. Can we make better choices? Aren't you glad you came to my psychotherapy lecture?
And we're going to take questions. Bobby's in charge of that. But thank you all for coming
here?
out.
Yes,
this day.
wonderful.
And she did bring out the sunshine. Still windy, but she brought
That's
the
right.
sunshine.
Now, if you have a question, just put your hand up. Julianne's over there with a microphone, and I'm here with one.
I loved your book. It was so entertaining, and thank you for bringing her back to life. You were very balanced in your description of her as an ambassador, both the negatives and the positives. And you did not tip your hand at all about what you thought about putting a woman with very little actual political experience in that role. I wanted to know your opinion.
One of my closest friends, a woman named Jane Hartley, has been ambassador to both France and most recently to England. And I'm so aware of all of the education and background and experience in the business world, political world, that Jane brought to that. So against that backdrop, kind of look at Pearl and you think, wow, she really did not have, those kind of chops. At the same time, she had presided over a salon of Washington for many years. So she understood how politics worked. She understood how to kind of work the levers. So at the end of the day, I think she did a very good job. And that's what a lot of the, even though she came to this, and she was worried about taking the job. She knew she didn't, she's never someone she wasn't a great policy reader. But I think in terms of what she wanted to do for America and what Truman wanted her to do, she put a good face on the country for the foreigners.
One of the most poignant aspects of the book was her relationships with her family, and especially her sister. And I wonder if you might just say a little bit about that.
Pearl had this gorgeous younger sister, Marguerite, who, as a young woman, was a great actress on stage and screen. And as an 18-year-old, when she first burst into the headlines, their father said that Pearl would be Marguerite's chaperone. This is not the idea of the life that Pearl initially wanted to have. I've always been fascinated in Pearl's autobiography. She doesn't mention this at all. They traveled the country. They had all sorts of amazing experiences. But the women were close for the rest of their lives. And at various periods, Marguerite lived with Pearl, moved in with Pearl. They shared a house in Washington together. Marguerite, it was interesting because once she got married, and she married twice, she didn't want to act anymore, but she was almost good at, like setting the stage, like organizing parties and decorating houses. And it was interesting, the sisters almost had a switch. Marguerite was, was the star and Pearl was in the background, and then Pearl was the star and Marguerite was in the background. And one of the sadder parts is Marguerite predeceased Pearl, and they were both Christian scientists, and Marguerite believed in the power of prayer, and if she could have called a doctor, she might have lived.
Her children, though,
One of her children also died because of appendicitis and Christian Science, yeah.
but wasn't the other daughter close to Pearl to the end?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
Pearl didn't have kids, obviously.
But she had very close nieces and nephews.
Yesterday, many of us heard a lecture about Pamela Harriman.
Ah.
And in many ways, they remind me of one another. They're both people who, through their wits, kind of got into the highest circles. And I'm wondering if you happen to know if they knew one another.
I'm sure they did, but I didn't see much overlapping. What's sort of interesting is that Pamela, as you know, was the great beauty and, had an amazing number of interesting men in her life. Pearl, alas, was not a great beauty. So she had to do what she did on, on charm and, goodwill.
I just did a tour of the Annenberg's place in Palm Springs. Have you ever explored writing about her?
There have been books written about her. That's a wonderful, you went Sunnylands.
Yeah.
I've been
Yeah.
there. It was great. Linda helped me to be invited to the Rancho Mirage Book Festival. So yes, she's another fascinating woman, ambassador to England, all sorts of great things.
I did receive a call today from a former Boca Grande resident, longtime resident, David Futch. He's an author, and he lives in Austin, Texas now. And he was just so excited that you were coming. He loved your book.
Oh, thank you.
And he commented, he had two comments I told him I would share with you. The first was, he said, she was more influential than LBJ.
I don't think so.
Well, hyperbole, right? And then the second thing, he had a local question. Had Pearl Mesta ever met Louise Crowninshield?
Probably, because the name rings a bell, and I'm sure if I went back and did a search of their names, I would find that. Both of LBJ's daughters were terrific in making the time to speak to me, and they were very funny about, Daddy. Pearl thought Daddy had potential, so I enjoyed, and they remembered him, and they still had furniture. One of the sweeter stories, after Kennedy became president, Pearl didn't want to live in Washington anymore, and so she knew she and her sister and brother-in-law needed to sell their house, and she knew just the person who would need a new house for entertaining the new vice president, Lyndon Johnson. So she sold them the house at a kind of reasonable price, and what Lucy remembered, that Pearl was getting rid of furniture, and that she and her mother went over to look at what was in the house, and that Lucy was taking piano lessons and fell in love with the baby Grand. And she really wanted it, and she was lobbying her mother hard, and Lady Bird was like, Lucy, I love you, but you're a terrible piano player. This is not going to happen for you. And Lucy said the day that they moved into the house, she said, I was kind of skipping through, and there was the piano with a big red bow and a note from Pearl saying, you win. And she still has the piano.
Oh, what a great
Down in Oxon.
story.
Yeah.
What a great story. So we'll have a book signing right here at this table. The book is still for sale over here. Deanna, in front of the Shell Collection, has the book for everyone who wants to buy it, who hasn't read it yet. And I just want to thank you, Meryl. It's been
I want to
lovely
thank all of
meeting
you.
you.
I
Thank you,
can't tell you
Linda.
how touched I am that you all came out in this weather. Thank you.